I think the first thing you should know about Russia and Ukraine is that almost every Russian that I know of considers the Crimea to be a part of Russia, not Ukraine. And that when Stalin created the 15 republics of the USSR, it didn't much matter where the boundary lines went. It was all one big country, and he just arbitrarily included Crimea in Ukraine. So after the Soviet Union broke up, many Russians I knew, very moderate, well-read, reasonable Russians, said that was a mistake. They should have allowed Crimea to be part of Russia and not Ukraine. But nobody really did anything about it at the time. But you should, as you think about this issue today, you should remember that in Russia, I would say some very high percentage of Russians consider Crimea a legitimate part of Ukraine. And there's some historical justification for that belief. Certainly there's historical justification for the Crimean part of it. Now, secondly, the Russian economy depends to a certain extent on a stable Ukraine. To oversimplify a complex situation, Russia and Ukraine trade wheat for natural gas. And it's a big part of both of their economies. Russia also fears Ukraine's move to the West. And that was the particular issue which brought about this crisis. Ukraine was in desperate economic situation, wanted to do something to change the situation, and they were faced with two offers. One to join the European Union, which they thought over the long term would help them establish a better economy, and the other was to accept a large loan, I think it was $15 billion, from Russia that would solve their immediate problems. They had a pressing immediate debt problem. The president decided to accept the Russian offer, and the people of Ukraine were outraged by this, and that's what stimulated the protests. Eventually, the overthrowing of the president and his apparently leaving the country for fear of his life. So Russia's fear then is that Ukraine will be moving to the West and would really are willing to take very extreme measures to keep that from happening. The first measure was making this very generous offer of a loan of $15 billion, and now we see less generous offers, less generous moves being made. Another concern in Russia, they fear that success of a popular revolt in Ukraine could become contagious. When Putin looks out at the 100,000 people in the squares of Kiev, he thinks of the 100,000 people who were in the Red Square in Moscow protesting his election. So he does not want this idea of popular revolts spreading to Russia, and therefore he's not anxious to see the Ukraine revolt being successful. So he decided to act strongly. There should be no doubt about that. And when we think about his decision, understand that he has all the cards. What are the cards? First of all, he has the dominant military force in the region. I sort of looked down on Russia's conventional military forces earlier in my talk, but when you compare them to Ukrainian military forces, they look pretty good. So in the region, he has a dominant military force and is prepared to use it. Secondly, he has a great advantage in the money. He's always tried to buy his way out of this problem with his offer of a loan to Ukraine, but he does have the money, and the European Union was not willing to make a comparable offer to Ukraine. And he has the natural gas, which Ukraine is totally dependent on. Russia is also dependent on Ukraine to a certain extent because the pipelines, natural gas pipelines to Europe, go through Ukraine. So, as I said, he has all the cards, and I'm perfectly convinced that Putin is prepared to play any or all of those cards necessary to assure his desired outcome. He believes the United States and the United Nations have none of these cards, and he believes that neither the United States or the United Nations have the will to try to stop him. And I must say, I think he is probably right in that assessment. So what is the outcome likely to be? The minimum change, the minimum outcome, will be for Ukraine with an administration that is suddenly friendly to Russia and that puts the Russian minority in Ukraine in a privileged position, and one that arranges for its policies to be compliant with Russian policies. That is one possible outcome. Another possible outcome, which is somewhat more severe, is that Ukraine becomes divided into two countries. Western Ukraine, which is westward-leaning and typically anti-Russian for historical reasons as well as present reasons today, becoming one state, and the rest of Ukraine, Crimea and possibly some of southeastern Ukraine, becoming another country. That country, Crimea and southeast Ukraine, being basically a client state of Russia, and the rest, the western Ukraine, if not a client state, at least not taking actions which displease Russia. Those are two possible outcomes in Ukraine today.